There is a particular kind of cold that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with wind or drama. It settles. It presses down on the land the way a hand presses on a wound, steady and without mercy, and it does not lift until it has taken something from you. The people who had never wintered on the Dakota Plains could not have understood this. The people who had wintered there once understood it completely, and the ones who had wintered there more than once had stopped trying to explain it to anyone who hadn't felt it themselves. Some knowledge lives only in the body. Some knowledge can only be earned. The winter of 1891 going into 1892 was the kind of winter that became a reference point. For years after, when the cold came down hard in November and the older settlers pulled their coats tighter and looked at the sky with that particular expression that had no name, but everyone recognized, they would say it quietly, almost to themselves, not as bad as 92. Or they would say nothing at all because some of them had learned that the worst winters were better left unspoken, the way certain griefs are better left unspoken, because naming them gives them a permanence they don't deserve. In the first days of March 1892, when the storm that would define that winter finally broke and the cleanup began, a man named Orrin Pfeiffer was found in his barn. He was 71 years old. He had lived alone on his homestead in the northern stretch of the territory for more than 2 decades. He knew Dakota winters the way a man knows the face of someone he has argued with for a long time, every expression, every warning sign, every way it could turn ugly without notice. And still the cold had taken him. He had made it from his house to his barn. He had covered the 40 steps between the two structures in what must have been conditions that defied movement, that turned the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other into something closer to a battle than a chore. He had made it to his barn. He had not made it back. 40 steps. 40 steps was the distance between the life he had built over 20 years and the cold that ended it. The people who found him talked about it for a long time afterward, the way communities talk about the things that frighten them most, which is to say they talked about it until the talking became a way of processing the fear, and then they talked about it a little longer still because the fear didn't fully process. It stayed. It settled in the way that Dakota cold settled, steady and without mercy, in the part of the mind that runs underneath conscious thought. What most of those people did not talk about, at least not in the same breath, was what had happened 2 miles to the south on the same night. On the same night that Orrin Pfeiffer made his last 40 steps across frozen ground, a woman named Clara Voss had not opened her front door once. Not once in 3 days. She had not wrapped herself in layers and leaned into the wind and crossed the distance between her house and her barn in the dark, the way every other homesteader in those parts had done since the first settlers broke ground on the territory. She had not done any of that. She had walked to her animals the way a person walks down a hallway in their own home. She had tended everything that needed tending. She had lost nothing. And she had done it because of something she understood about the ground beneath her feet that the rest of them had not yet learned to pay attention to. This is the story of how she came to understand it. Edmund Voss died in the spring of 1888. He died in the particular unremarkable way that men died on the frontier in those years, not from anything dramatic, not from a story worth telling, but from an infection that started small and spread in the way that infections spread when there is no doctor within a full day's ride and no way to know that what looks manageable on Monday will be unmanageable by Thursday. He was 38 years old. He had been a decent man and a willing worker, and he had loved his wife in the uncomplicated way of a man who did not spend a great deal of time examining his own feelings, but acted on them consistently, which is perhaps the more durable form of love anyway. He left Clara with 2 children, a parcel of land that was barely broken, and a barn that still smelled of the green lumber it had been built from the previous autumn. He left her with a mortgage on the land that had seemed manageable when there were 2 of them and became something different entirely when there was 1. He left her, in other words, with everything a frontier widow was left with and nothing extra. Clara Voss was 35 years old when Edmund died. She had been a school teacher in Ohio before the marriage in a small town outside Columbus, where she had taught the children of farmers and tradesmen for 6 years. She had been good at it, not because she was naturally patient, though she had patience when the situation required it, but because she was genuinely curious about how things worked, and that curiosity was contagious. Her students caught it from her the way children catch attitudes from the adults they spend their days with, without knowing they're catching anything at all. The curiosity had not left her when she followed Edmund West. It had simply redirected itself toward the new set of problems that frontier life presented, which were numerous and unrelenting and interesting in the way that hard problems are always interesting to people who would rather solve a problem than surrender to it. She was not a large woman. She was not especially striking in any particular way. Her hands by the summer of 1888 showed every season she had spent working, land that didn't want to be worked, and her face showed the particular kind of tiredness that is different from exhaustion. That is the tiredness of a person who has been operating at the edge of their capacity for so long that they have simply recalibrated what normal feels like. She kept her dark hair pinned back in the practical way of a woman who does not have time to think about her hair, and she wore the same three dresses in rotation through the work week and saved the fourth for Sundays, in the rare occasions when she needed to present herself as something other than a woman in the middle of surviving. Her daughter Nora was 8 years old when Edmund died. Her son Owen was not yet 2. Nora had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, which is perhaps the best possible combination in a child who is going to need to be resilient. Owen was still young enough that the loss of his father would register in him not as memory, but as a kind of permanent absence, the way a room feels different when a piece of furniture has been removed, even when you can no longer quite remember what the furniture looked like. The nearest neighbor of any consequence was a man named Bertram Holt, who ran a cattle operation about 2 miles to the north as the crow flies. Bertram was somewhere past 50, a wide-shouldered man with a beard the color of iron shavings, and the manner of someone who had formed opinions about how things ought to be done and had not encountered sufficient evidence to revise them. He was not unkind. He was the kind of man who helped when help was needed and expected the same in return, and would have called this arrangement neighborliness, which in fact it was. He was also the kind of man who trusted experience over theory and had a deep and largely unexamined suspicion of any approach to a problem that hadn't been tried and tested by someone he respected. Beyond Bertram, perhaps another mile and a half in the same general direction the Strand family had settled more recently. The father was a quiet man who kept to himself. His son Arvid was 20 years old that summer, broad through the shoulders like his father, but quicker to grin, the kind of young man who is fundamentally good-natured, but has not yet learned that good nature and casual cruelty are not mutually exclusive, that you can mean no real harm and still cause it. To the south, closer to 3 miles distant, a widow named Mabel Denker ran a small sheep operation with the help of her grown son. Mabel was a woman of strong opinions and stronger convictions, and she expressed both with a directness that she considered a virtue and that other people sometimes considered something else. She had survived 6 Dakota winters on her own and believed not unreasonably, given the evidence, that the methods she had used to survive them were the correct methods because she was still alive and still standing and still producing wool enough to see her through each year. These were the people who formed the edges of Clara's world in the summer of 1888. Not a community in any organized sense. Scattered homesteads separated by enough empty country to make self-reliance not a philosophy but a simple description of what was required. The nearest town of any real size was the better part of a day's journey in good conditions. The subscription school that Nora attended was 4 miles away. The doctor was farther. The first summer without Edmund was the hardest summer of Clara's life, and she had had summers that tested her. She had to learn by doing a dozen things that Edmund had done and that she had watched being done without ever needing to learn the doing of them herself. She made mistakes that cost her time and resources she could not spare. She learned from the mistakes with the grim efficiency of someone who cannot afford to make the same mistake twice. She kept a small leather journal, so a habit from her teaching years, and she recorded in it what she learned and what she failed at and what she intended to try differently. By the end of that first summer, she was beginning to find her footing, not comfortably, not with any sense of security, but the way a person finds footing on uneven ground one step at a time, testing each placement before committing to it. Then November came. The root cellar beneath the house was not a large space. It was dug 6 feet down, which was standard for the territory, deep enough to stay reliably above freezing through the worst of winter, used for storing the vegetables and preserved goods that would see a family through until spring. Clara had been down in it dozens of times since they had moved to the property. It was a practical space, and she thought of it in practical terms. She went down one afternoon in November of 1888 to retrieve a jar of preserved beans for the evening meal. The cold that year had come early and come hard, and the temperature above ground had been dropping for a week in a way that made every outdoor task feel like an argument you were losing. She came down the short ladder into the cellar and reached for the jar she wanted and then stopped. She stood still for a moment, and she felt it. The air down there was not warm. She would not have called it warm, but it was something that the air above ground had stopped being 2 weeks earlier. It was stable. It had weight and substance without the cutting edge that every breath outside had taken on. She stood in the dim light with the jar in her hand, and she breathed in and breathed out, and she thought the ground is doing something. The ground is holding something in. Whatever the sky is doing up there, the earth 6 feet below it is operating on entirely different terms. She stood there for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she climbed back up and went and started the evening meal. But something had shifted. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way of sudden revelations that announce themselves. It shifted the way understanding shifts when a piece of information you have had for a long time finally connects to another piece of information you have had for just as long, and you realize that the connection was always there and you simply hadn't looked at the two pieces at the same time before. She thought about the barn. She thought about the 40 steps between the barn and the house. She thought about her animals on one end of that 40 steps and her family on the other end, and all that frozen ground lying between them, and what the ground was doing 6 feet down, and what it was not doing at the surface. And she began slowly to think about whether those two things were connected in a way that mattered. She did not act on it that night, or that week, or that winter. What she did instead was begin to pay attention in a different way than she had paid attention before. The winter of 1888 into 1889 was not the worst Dakota winter on record, but it was sufficient. It was sufficient to demonstrate everything the country was capable of. All the ways the cold worked its way through walls and into lungs and into the joints of animals that were trying to maintain body heat against odds that kept shifting against them. Clara made the trips from the house to barn and back again the way everyone made them, wrapped in everything she owned, moving as fast as the conditions allowed, which was sometimes not very fast at all. She noticed things on those trips because noticing things was what she did. She noticed how long her body took to recover its normal temperature after each crossing. She noticed the particular way Owen coughed for 30 minutes after she brought him out into the cold for any reason, a deep rattling cough that worried her in the night even after it stopped. She noticed the base of the barn's north wall, where the timber met the earth, and how that section never frosted, the way the upper sections frosted even in the worst cold. And she opened her journal and she wrote it down. She wrote down the date and the temperature, as best she could estimate it in what she had observed and what she thought it might mean. She wrote it down the way she had taught her students to write down observations, not as conclusions, not as proof of anything, but as data, as the raw material from which understanding might eventually bubble if enough of it was gathered with enough care. In January of 1889, Bertram Holt lost 2 hogs to what he called the chill. Clara heard about it when Bertram mentioned it in passing during a brief exchange at the boundary fence between their properties. He said it with the flat resignation of a man who has accepted losses as the cost of doing business. In a difficult country, the way you might mention a fence post that had gone rotten. Unfortunate, but not surprising. Clara expressed her sympathy and then walked back to her house, and recorded in the journal the date and what Bertram had told her, including the number of animals lost and what he believed the cause had been. She wrote it without comment, just the facts of it recorded alongside her own observations from that same week, which included notes on the temperature at the base of her barn wall, and the temperature 3 feet up from the ground and 6 feet up, which she had measured with a small thermometer she kept for the purpose, and which she checked every third day throughout that winter. She did not tell Bertram she was doing this. She did not tell anyone. Through 1889 and into 1890, and then through 1890 and into 1891, the journal filled pages of temperature readings, pages of notes on animal behavior, on hay consumption, on the condition of livestock at the beginning and end of each week through the winter months, notes on firewood, notes on how many times she had opened the main door to the outside on days when the temperature dropped below a certain point, and how the interior temperature of the house responded to each opening. It was not a scientific document in any formal sense. Clara had no scientific training, but it had the discipline of a scientific document because it had been assembled by someone who understood that the difference between knowing and guessing was evidence, and that evidence required patience and consistency and the willingness to record things that didn't yet mean anything in hopes that they eventually would. By the autumn of 1891, she had made up her mind. She went to see Bertram Holt in September of that year, before she began any of the work, because she believed that what she had observed was worth sharing, and because she respected Bertram's experience, even where she disagreed with his conclusions. She brought the journal. Bertram received her on the porch of his house in the way of a man who considers himself hospitable, but has certain reservations about unexpected visits from neighbors, which he managed by standing rather than sitting, and by the particular way he held his coffee cup close to his chest, which Clara had come to recognize as his posture of polite resistance. She showed him the journal. She walked him through 3 years of temperature readings. She showed him the pages from January 1889 that recorded the loss of his 2 hogs alongside her own observations from that same week. She showed him the correlation visible across 3 winters of data between the temperature differential at the base of barn walls versus higher up, and the rate at which livestock declined in condition through the coldest months. She explained what she intended to do about it. A tunnel from the house to the barn running beneath the frost line where the ground temperature held stable, regardless of what the surface was doing. A passage that would allow her to move between buildings without the repeated exchanges of cold and warm air that cost firewood and cost animal condition and cost human health over the course of a Dakota winter. Bertram listened. He looked at the journal when she held it toward him. He read a few pages with the expression of a man reading a document in a language he is only partially familiar with. Then he set the journal gently on the porch railing and looked out at the distance for a moment. He said, "Those numbers don't prove what you think they prove, Mrs. Voss." Clara waited. He said that ground tunnels were used in mines and in certain kinds of ice storage operations, and that he could see what she was getting at, but that the freeze-thaw cycle in this part of the territory was hard on anything underground, and that the amount of work involved in what she was describing was considerable, and that he wasn't sure the investment of that work was justified by the benefits she expected to get from it. He said it carefully, which she appreciated, even if she disagreed with every part of it. What he said to the Strand family the following week, without the careful phrasing, was that Clara Voss had been alone too long and had started constructing elaborate explanations for things that didn't require explaining, and that someone ought to keep an eye on her in the spring. Clara did not know what Bertram said to the Strand family. She knew what he said to her face, and she thanked him for his time and took her journal and walked the 2 miles home in the cooling September air. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the shared mail pickup point that served the scattered homesteads in that part of the territory. The letter was from Mabel Denker, addressed not to Clara, but to the general community, and its contents were straightforward. Mabel was concerned that one of their neighbors had developed a scheme that would waste significant resources and potentially create a hazard, and she was writing to suggest that no one lend tools or materials to support the project until cooler heads had reviewed it. Mabel had never been a woman who did things halfway. Clara's neighbor's boy brought the letter over because he thought she ought to know about it. Clara read it standing in the yard. She read it all the way through, which took perhaps 2 minutes. Then she folded it along its original creases and set it on the kitchen table and went out to the yard where she had already driven a series of short stakes into the earth connected by lengths of twine, marking the path of the first section of tunnel from barn to grain storage. She walked the line of stakes, once checking the alignment, adjusting one that had shifted slightly in the overnight wind. Then she went inside, ate her supper, read to Owen until he fell asleep, reviewed 3 pages of her journal by lamplight, and went to bed. In the morning, she started digging. The young man, Arvid Strand, came by on a horse 3 days after Clara began. He had been riding the long way around from his family's place and had come up the road that ran past the front of Clara's property, and he pulled up when he saw what was happening in the yard. He sat on his horse for a moment, looking at the line of stakes and the fresh-turned earth and the growing mound of excavated soil that Clara was building to the side of the trench she was cutting. Clara was in the trench at the time about 18 inches down, working with a mattock at a section of root-laced soil that was resisting her in the specific way that prairie soil resists, as though it has decided it has been undisturbed long enough that it has a right to stay that way. She heard the horse stop and looked up. Arvid Strand had the open, uncomplicated face of a young man who has not yet accumulated enough difficulty to give his features any weight. He looked at the trench and then at Clara, and then at the trench again with the expression of someone encountering something they cannot immediately categorize. He asked what she was building. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh in any deliberate sense. It was the laugh of someone genuinely baffled, the way a person laughs at something that seems so far outside the range of reasonable behavior that laughter is the only available response. He said he had heard of plenty of ways to spend a good autumn, and that digging a tunnel to your barn was a new one. He rode on. Clara watched him go for a moment. Then she looked back at the section of root-laced soil that was resisting her. She adjusted her grip on the mattock and kept working. The story moved through the community the way stories move through isolated communities, which is to say, faster than seems possible, given the distances involved carried by the invisible channels of information that run between homesteads, the way underground water runs between wells untraceable but reliable. Within 2 weeks, everyone within a reasonable radius knew that the Voss widow had lost her measure and was digging up her yard. Mabel Denker sent her grown son over with a basket and a note. The basket contained a small jar of jam and a loaf of bread, which was Mabel's way of ensuring that the message that followed could not be mistaken for simple hostility. The note said that Mabel was concerned for Clara's well-being and for the safety of her children, and that she would be glad to discuss alternative approaches to whatever problem Clara believed she was solving, and that the community was here to help if Clara found herself overwhelmed. The message underneath the message was the same one Bertram had delivered in his careful words about freeze-thaw cycles, and the same one Arvid Strand had delivered in his laughter. She was wrong. She was wasting what she had. The way things had always been done was the way things were done for reasons that a person new to this country and new to this kind of life had not yet earned the right to question. Clara's son Owen ate some of the jam. Clara thanked Mabel's son for making the trip and told him to pass on her regards to his mother. Then she went back to the trench. Her hands had blistered in the first 3 days, and the blisters had opened, and the open blisters had begun the process of hardening into something more durable, which is what hands do when you ask them to do more than they were previously accustomed to doing. She had stopped noticing the blisters by the end of the first week because the rest of the work demanded enough attention that there was none left over for the condition of her hands. Nora, who was 11 now and understood without being told that her mother had a purpose worth assisting with, came out after the school day ended each afternoon and worked beside her. She was strong for her size, and she had her father's stubbornness operating in her favor, which meant that once she committed to a task, she did not stop unless someone made her. She carried the excavated earth away from the trench in a bucket, one bucket at a time, building the long, low mound that ran alongside the dig. She held the lantern in the evenings when the light failed, but Clara was not ready to stop. She did not complain, and she did not ask when it would be finished. The ground cooperated in some places and resisted in others. There were sections where the soil came up in great satisfying chunks that split clean along their natural fracture lines, and there were sections threaded through with the roots of grass that had been growing undisturbed for longer than anyone in the territory could estimate roots, that ran horizontal and deep and dense as rope. And those sections took twice the time of the easy sections and left Clara's arms aching in ways that reached from her wrists to the tops of her shoulders. She built a tunnel as she dug it, setting lengths of cottonwood timber along the sides for walls and laying cut logs across the top for a roof, working in the method she had worked out from observation, from watching the way the old dugout cellars in the area had been constructed and the way the hand-dug wells were lined, and the way one or two of the older homesteaders had built their underground storage areas. There was no one to teach her the correct method. She determined the method from what she could observe of structures that had worked and structures that had failed, and she applied the method, and when part of it didn't work, she revised it. The tunnel ran the width of 2 shoulders side by side. A person could move through it in a low crouch. It ran below the frost line, which in Dakota territory in those years meant going down far enough that the ground temperature stabilized where the earth stopped responding to what was happening at the surface and started doing what it had been doing for longer than anyone had been there to observe it. She worked through October and into November, 6 days a week before and after the other work that couldn't wait. The livestock still needed feeding. Owen still needed looking after. The house still needed its fire maintained. The journal still received its entries because Clara had learned that the habit of recording things was not something you kept only when circumstances were convenient, but something you kept especially when they weren't, because those were the circumstances that produced the most useful information. The community's commentary continued in the background of all of it, not loud, not aggressive, but present. The way a low, persistent sound is present audible at the edges of everything without ever quite going away. She heard it secondhand through Nora, who came home from the subscription school one afternoon, with a look on her face that Clara recognized as the look of a child who has heard something said about her family that she does not intend to repeat, but cannot entirely hide the weight of. Clara did not ask Nora to tell her what had been said. She made supper, and they ate, and she read to Owen, and then she and Nora sat by the lamp for a while, and Clara worked on the journal, and Nora worked on her lessons. And after a time, Clara said without looking up, "The work is the answer to what people say. There is no other answer worth giving." Nora said nothing, but she nodded once, the kind of nod that means a thing has landed and been stored somewhere useful. The next morning, she was back at the trench before Clara, already working, not needing to be asked. Bertram Holt passed by the property one afternoon in late October on his way back from somewhere and slowed his horse on the road when he saw the scale of the excavation. Clara was working at the far section at the time, the longer run toward the house, and she looked up when she heard the horse stop. Bertram sat in his saddle and looked at what she had built. He sat there for what was probably less than a minute, but felt longer. His expression was not readable from where she stood. It was not mockery, and it was not the polite skepticism he had shown on his porch in September. It was something she could not name. He tipped his hat. He rode on. He did not offer to help. She had not expected him to. By early December, she was finished. She had been working for close to 2 months, most of it alone. The tunnel ran the complete circuit from the root cellar entry beneath the house to the grain storage, and from there to the barn with small earthen shelves cut into the walls at intervals where a lantern could be set. On the evening she declared it finished, she walked it from one end to the other with a lantern in her hand, and Nora walking behind her, and the feeling inside that passage was exactly what she had stood in the root cellar 3 years earlier and understood for the first time. Not warm the way a room with a fire burning is warm, but stable, protected, like the ground itself had wrapped around you and decided without drama or announcement simply to decline to let the cold in. She stood in the barn at the far end of the tunnel and listened to her animals moving in the way animals move when they are not distressed. Steady, unhurried, indifferent to the cold pressing on the walls above them. Nora stood beside her in the lamplight and looked at what her mother had built. Clara did not say anything for a long moment. There was nothing that needed saying. The tunnel said it. The stable air said it. The animals going about the uncomplicated business of being animals in a space that was holding its temperature against the December night outside said it more clearly than any words she had available to her. She turned and led Nora back through the passage toward the house, the lantern throwing their shadows long against the earthen walls, the ground steady and quiet all around them, doing what it had always been doing, holding what it had always held patient in the way that the earth is patient, which is to say completely and without any apparent interest in whether anyone was paying attention or not. Clara had been paying attention. For 3 years she had been paying attention, and now she had built something from it. The first morning she walked to her barn in her house clothes, she stopped halfway through the tunnel and held the lantern up and looked at the earthen wall beside her. She pressed her palm flat against it. The soil was cool against her skin. Not cold. There is a difference between cool and cold that most people understand in the abstract, but rarely think about in practical terms. Cool is stable. Cool is the temperature of something that has reached equilibrium with its surroundings and decided to stay there. Cold is aggressive. Cold is the temperature of something that wants to take what you have. The wall was cool, the tunnel was cool, and Clara was standing in it wearing the same dress she had cooked breakfast in with no coat and no wrapping and no layers of wool, and she was completely fine. She lowered the lantern and kept walking. The barn smelled the way barns smell in winter hay, in animal warmth, in the particular close smell of large creatures generating heat in an enclosed space. Her 2 milk cows turned their heads when she came through the tunnel entry and regarded her with the mild, incurious gaze of animals who have decided that a person who brings food is worth acknowledging, but not worth getting excited about. The horses shifted in their stalls, but did not startle. The pigs in their partitioned section of the barn were already moving, already investigating the corners of their pen with the busy nose-down energy of animals that have slept well and are ready for the day. Clara stood in the barn doorway for a moment and looked at all of it. Then she began her work. What she noticed first was the quiet, not the absence of sound, because a barn full of animals is never truly silent, but the absence of a particular kind of disruption that she had grown so accustomed to that she had stopped registering it as disruption. Every time she had opened the barn door from the outside in previous winters, a volume of cold air had entered with her. Not a little cold air, a substantial quantity of air, at a temperature that the animals had been working against for weeks, air that required their bodies to respond to burn additional reserves just to compensate for the sudden change. And she had done this 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a day in the worst weather because the animals needed that much attention, and the weather did not adjust its schedule to suit the requirements of livestock management. Now she came through from below. The temperature in the tunnel and the temperature in the barn were close enough to each other that her arrival did not register as a disruption. She moved among the animals, and they moved around her, and there was a steadiness to all of it that she had not experienced in a barn in winter before. She checked the journal entries from the previous 2 winters. She had recorded animal behavior throughout those winters with the same consistency she had recorded everything else. She had notes on restlessness, on the way the horses had moved in their stalls during cold snaps, on the way the pigs had clustered and how their clustering was a response to temperature stress that cost them energy they needed for other purposes. The notes from those winters and the observations from this winter were different in ways that were not subtle. The animals were calmer. They were eating at a steadier rate. The pigs, which were the most sensitive to temperature fluctuations and the most reliable indicators of whether conditions were within a comfortable range or outside it, were gaining weight instead of losing it through the early weeks of December. This was not what happened in December. In December, animals typically began the slow process of drawing down their reserves against the cold, a process that continued through January and February and left them thinner and diminished by the time spring arrived, requiring weeks of recovery feeding before they were fully productive again. Not this December. She also began tracking her firewood consumption more carefully than she had in previous winters, because the firewood told a story about the house that the barn observations alone could not. Every time a frontier door opened in January, the interior of the house reset. Not immediately, not all at once, but the process began. The warm air that had taken hours and a certain quantity of wood to build up inside the walls went out, and the cold air came flooding in, and the fire had to begin the work of recovery. A family making 6 trips a day between house and barn was opening and closing the main exterior door 12 times. Each opening was a small reset. 12 small resets a day across the 120 days of a real Dakota winter was not a small number of resets. Claire had been making almost none of them. By the second week of January, the woodpile was running ahead of her projections. Not dramatically ahead, but measurably so, tracked against 2 prior winters worth of records for the same period. One evening in the middle of that second week, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out across the yard. The temperature outside was somewhere that made the air itself seem to have weight pressing down on everything visible. Across the 2 miles of open ground to the north, she could just make out the dim shape of Bertram Holt moving between his house and his barn, a dark figure bent against the cold, wrapped in everything he owned, fighting for every step. He made it to the barn. She watched the door close behind him. She thought about what that crossing had cost him in body heat, in wood, in time, in simple human endurance. And she thought about what it would cost him again when he came back. Then she turned from the window, checked on Owen, and went to sit by the fire with her journal. She recorded the firewood figures. She wrote nothing else about what she had seen. The number said what needed saying. January deepened. The cold that came down in the second week of January in that part of Dakota Territory was not unusual for the season, but it was not mild either. It was the kind of cold that made the walls of a house contract at night, a sound Clara had learned to sleep through in her first winter, but that Owen still sometimes woke at that particular sharp crack of frozen wood giving and settling that sounded if you were half asleep and not accustomed to it, like something breaking. Clara maintained her routine. She rose before full light. She went through the root cellar and through the tunnel to the barn. She tended the animals. She returned the same way. Owen and Nora woke to a house that had not been opened to the outside overnight, that had held its warmth through the night, without the resets that came from getting up at 2 in the morning to check on livestock, because the temperature had dropped and you were worried. Nora had grown into the work over the past months in a way that Clara watched with a particular mixture of pride and something adjacent to sorrow. Not sorrow for Nora exactly. Sorrow for the speed of it, for the way necessity compressed childhood into something that looked from the outside like the practical competence of a person considerably older than 11. Nora could assess the condition of a milk cow by watching her move from across the barn. She could estimate the hay consumption rate by eye and tell you whether it was running high or low for the week. She kept these things in her head the way Clara kept them in the journal, and she reported them at supper with the calm matter-of-factness of someone delivering information that matters and knows it. Owen had begun following his sister the way small children follow older siblings who seem to understand things they do not yet understand, which is to say, with complete and uncritical trust. He was not yet old enough to contribute meaningfully to the work, but he was old enough to want to, and Nora had developed the patience to include him in small tasks that gave him the feeling of contribution without adding significantly to her own workload, which was already more than most 11-year-olds carried. Clara watched her children manage this winter and thought, this is what I built it for. Not just for the animals, not just for the firewood numbers, for this. For Owen not coughing through the night because he had to be brought out into cold air. For Nora, moving through her mornings without the constant weight of exposure that ground down a person's reserves in ways that didn't show up immediately but accumulated. For all three of them, arriving at spring with something left. It was in the third week of January that the section of tunnel between the grain storage and the barn showed the first sign of stress. Clara noticed it on her morning round, a slight compression in one of the side timbers, a crack running through the packed earth of the ceiling above a span of about 3 feet. Not a collapse, not imminent danger, but a warning, the kind of warning that structures give you when they are under a load they were not quite designed for, telling you in the language of material fatigue that something needs attention before something needs much more than attention. She examined it carefully, running her hands along the timber and along the earth above it, pressing to test the give, listening to what the structure was telling her about its own condition. She had an idea about how to fix it. It required additional timber and a different angle of support than she had used in the original construction, a diagonal brace rather than a vertical one, distributing the load differently across the span. She had observed this approach in the construction of one of the older dugout storage areas near the subscription school, a structure that had been standing for nearly 15 years in ground that froze and thawed every year. She did not have the timber on hand. She went to Bertram Holt first. Bertram said he was sorry she was having trouble with it. He said he did not have spare timber he could let go of at the moment. He said this in the careful, factual way of a man who is not quite lying, but is not quite telling the full truth either, and Clara thanked him and walked home. She tried the Strand property next. Arvid's father said he did not have what she needed. Arvid, who was in the yard when she arrived and had watched the exchange from a distance, did not offer anything and did not meet her eyes when she passed him on her way out. She found what she needed from the Bauman family, who lived about 8 miles to the east and ran a small lumber operation alongside their farming. She paid more than she would have paid from a neighbor. She hauled it herself, making 2 trips with the wagon over 2 days of cold that tested her resolve in concrete physical terms, because 8 miles in January was not 8 miles in any other season. She made both trips. She brought the timber home. And on the second evening, with Nora holding the lantern in the confined space of the tunnel, Clara repaired the compromised section using the diagonal bracing approach she had worked out from her observations, fitting the timber into place with the same methodical patience she brought to every other problem that presented itself. It took 3 hours. When it was done, she ran her hands over the repair the same way she had run them over the stress fracture, testing, assessing, reading what the structure had to tell her about its own condition. It felt solid, better than what she had replaced. The load was distributing correctly. Nora held the lantern up so Clara could see the full span of the repair. She said in the flat tone she had developed for reporting things that mattered, that looked stronger than the original. Clara looked at it. She agreed that it did. They came back through the tunnel to the house, the cool, stable air of the passage around them, the ground holding its temperature on all sides, indifferent to whatever January was doing at the surface. February arrived with a particular clarity that experienced Dakota settlers knew to be suspicious. The clear, cold days of February, when the sky went a shade of blue that had no warmth in it anywhere, and the light came down bright and thin, were not comfortable days, but they were days you could manage. You could see the trouble coming on those days. You could move through them with intention. What experienced settlers did not trust was what came after that clarity. Clara had 3 winters in the territory behind her. She had not been there long enough to develop the instinctive meteorological suspicion of someone like Bertram Holt, the feeling in the body before the feeling in the air, the reading of particular cloud formations and particular wind shifts that could only be learned by surviving enough winters to see the patterns repeat. But she had been writing things down, and she had read those observations back to herself during the quieter periods of this winter, the way a student reads notes before an examination. She had noted in January of 1890 that the horses had been unsettled for 2 days before a hard, cold snap that came in without much warning. She had noted in February of 1891 that the pigs had refused their afternoon feeding for 3 days running before a storm that closed the roads for a week. These were not items she had recorded as predictions at the time. She had recorded them as the observations. She had not known when she wrote them down that she was building a vocabulary. By the first days of March 1892, he had been watching her animals for a week with a particular quality of attention that was different from her regular attention. The horses had begun moving in their stalls in the circular, repetitive way that she had noted twice before as a precursor to difficult weather. The pigs were clustered in the far corner of their pen, stacked against each other in the way animals stack when they are responding to something they know about before the air tells you about it. She split extra wood and brought it inside. She checked the tunnel from end to end, running her hands along every timber, checking every joint and walking the whole circuit twice. She filled the water vessels inside the house to a level that assumed she might not want to make the trip to the well for several days. She checked Owen's coat and Nora's coat and made sure both pairs of boots were in full working order. She did all of this without speaking about it to anyone because there was no one to speak to about it and because the preparation itself was the statement. The storm arrived in the first hours after midnight. The temperature had been dropping for 3 days. The sky had gone the color she had written down twice before the particular shade she had described as old iron flat, and weighted and without any of the texture that normal clouds carry. When it hit the way the worst things hit completely, and all at once no middle distance between what was and what it became. The temperature outside fell to a place that no thermometer Clara owned could accurately measure. The wind drove the snow horizontal, which meant the snow was not falling so much as traveling, moving at speed across the landscape in a white wall that reduced visibility to a distance shorter than the length of her arm. The sound of it was not the sound of a storm the way most people mean when they say storm. It was a sustained, pressing, enormous sound that sat on top of everything else and made everything else inaudible. Clara lay in her bed and listened to it and was not afraid. She was not afraid because she had done the work. The tunnel was there, the animals were in the barn, and the barn was connected to the house, and she could reach every living thing on her property without opening a single exterior door. She pulled the blanket up around Owen, who had woken at the sound of the storm beginning and then fallen back to sleep with the speed of children who are not afraid because they do not have enough information to be afraid of the right things. She checked that Nora was covered. She lay back down. In the morning, she would go through the tunnel and tend her animals. The morning would be identical in its procedure to every other morning of this winter, regardless of what was happening at the surface. She closed her eyes and she slept. The storm ran for 3 days. Not 3 days of unbroken blizzard in the way that word is sometimes used to mean any hard winter weather. 3 days of something more specific and more relentless than that. 3 days of cold that had stopped being a temperature and become a presence, a weight that pressed on every surface of every structure in that part of the territory and then looked for the gaps. 3 days of wind that did not gust and retreat the way wind normally does, that did not give you the small mercies of the lulls between, but simply leaned, constantly, without rest. Clara kept her routine. She rose before full light on the first morning of the storm, the same time she had risen every morning of that winter, and she went through the root cellar and into the tunnel and walked to the barn with her lantern. The sound of the storm was audible even underground. A low-pressured hum transmitted through the earth itself felt more than heard, like the vibration of something enormous passing at a distance. But the air in the tunnel was the same air it had been every other morning. The earthen walls held their temperature. The ground did not care what was happening at the surface. It never had. The animals were calm. This was the thing that struck her most on that first morning, walking into the barn, with the storm audible even through the walls, through the earth, through everything. The horses were eating. The cows stood steady. The pigs were active and nose down in their pen, doing what pigs do when they are comfortable and fed, and not spending their reserves on staying warm. She moved among them and they accepted her presence the way they always accepted her presence as a fact of their morning, rather than an intrusion. She made her notes in the corner of the barn by lantern light, crouching with the book on her knee. Temperature estimate, animal condition, hay consumption from the previous day. She wrote it down because she had always written it down and because the storm was not a reason to stop. If anything, the storm was the reason to be more precise. What happened in these 3 days would be the most important data she had ever collected, and she intended to collect it properly. She walked back through the tunnel to the house. She made breakfast. She stoked the fire, which had held well through the night because the house had not been open and the interior temperature had not been subjected to the repeated resets of exterior door use. She sat Owen down with his food, and she and Nora ate at the kitchen table, looking out the window at what the storm had done to the world outside. The world outside had been replaced. There was no other way to describe it. The familiar shapes of the yard, the fence line, the grain storage, the particular outline of the territory that she had memorized. In the way you memorize the face of a place you are committed to, all of it was gone. In its place was a moving white wall that had no depth and no detail at all and no reference points. Clara finished her breakfast and went back to the journal. The knock came on the afternoon of the second day. She heard it through the sound of the storm, which had not diminished. She heard it because whoever was on the other side of the door was not knocking in the tentative way of a person who is uncertain of their welcome. They were knocking with the particular urgency of a person who needs the door to open and has been outside long enough that politeness has become irrelevant. She opened it. Mabel Denker stood on the porch. She was wrapped in every layer she owned, and the layers were not enough. The cold had gotten into her face in the way it gets into faces when exposure has gone past discomfort and into something more serious, a grayness around the mouth, a particular stillness in the features that was not composure but its opposite. Her eyes were red from the wind. There was ice in her hair where it had escaped from under her hat. She had walked 3 miles through the second day of the worst storm in recent memory, and the fact of those 3 miles was written in every line of her body. She did not say anything immediately. She stood there and Clara looked at her, and the storm pressed at both of them from the side, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then Clara stepped back from the door and opened it wider. Mabel came inside. She stood in the entry and dripped and did not speak, and Clara did not ask her to speak. She took the outer layers from her, the coat and the wrapping and the hat, and she hung them near the stove to dry. And she brought Mabel to the chair closest to the fire, and she put the coffee pot on without asking whether coffee was wanted, because it was not a question that required asking. Mabel's son had gone out to the sheep that morning and come back with 2 fingers on his left hand that had the waxy, pale quality that fingers get when the blood has been forced away from them by cold and has not entirely returned. She had done what she knew to do for it, and she believed he would be all right, but she was not certain, and the storm had not let up, and the sheep were in the far corner of the barn in the way they had been before the storm started, and she did not know if the barn was holding or failing, and she had nowhere else to go. She said all of this to the fire, not to Clara. Looking at the flames while she talked, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup that Clara had placed in them without her noticing it arrive. Clara listened. She sat across the table and listened to all of it without interrupting, without offering opinions on any part of it, without doing anything other than being a person who was present and listening. When Mabel finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the storm and the fire. Clara said her son should keep the hand elevated and stay near the warmth, and she would look at it herself before dark. She said the barn structure in this part of the territory was generally sound, and that sheep were more resilient than people gave them credit for when they had each other for warmth. She said that Mabel should stay until the storm broke, and that there was room. Mabel looked at her for the first time since she had come inside. She did not say thank you. She did not say anything at all for a moment. Then she looked back at the fire and nodded once, a small, compressed nod that carried more weight than its size suggested. Clara got up and went to check on Owen. Bertram Holt arrived the following morning, the third day of the storm. Clara heard the horse before she heard the knock, the particular sound of an animal that has been pushed past its comfortable limits. She went to the door before he knocked. He stood on the porch and she looked at him and she understood immediately that something had gone wrong in a way that went past inconvenience. His face was the color of the winter sky, that flat iron gray that carried no warmth. His beard was solid with ice on the left side where the wind had been hitting him. He was holding his right hand in his left hand in the careful, deliberate way of a person protecting something that hurts. And when he moved his fingers slightly, she could see that two of them had the waxy look she had seen on Mabel's son the day before, though worse. He said standing on the porch that he had lost two hogs in the night. He said his wife had cried, which was a thing he reported as a fact without editorial, but the reporting of it told Clara everything she needed to know about what the loss meant. He said he had lost the feeling in the two fingers on his right hand making the trip between his house and the barn that morning, a trip he had made 100 times that in the conditions of the past 3 days had taken something considerably longer and cost considerably more. He had been outside for a long time. He had needed somewhere to be that wasn't outside. Clara brought him in. She sat him by the stove across from Mabel, who looked at him and said nothing. He looked at Mabel and said nothing. Two people who had each in their own way spent the past 2 months suggesting to anyone who would listen that Clara Voss had taken leave of her practical senses, sitting in Clara Voss's kitchen while the storm ran itself out against the walls, warming their hands on her cups. Clara gave Bertram coffee. She looked at his hand. She did what she could for the fingers, which she believed would recover fully if he stayed warm and kept the hand elevated. And she told him so in plain terms, and he nodded and accepted this information with the complete attention of a man who understands that the information matters. After a while, when the color had returned to his face and he had stopped holding his hand in that careful, protective way, Clara asked him if he wanted to see the tunnel. He looked at her across the table. Mabel in her chair by the fire did not turn around but became very still, in the way that people become still when they are listening to something without wanting to appear to be listening. Bertram said yes. Clara led him down through the root cellar and into the passage. She watched his face when he entered. He stopped walking approximately 8 feet into the passage at the point where the tunnel turned slightly and the entry behind them was no longer visible. He stopped and he stood there, and she watched him breathe in and breathe out slowly, registering something that his body understood before his mind had finished deciding whether to accept it. He put his hand against the earthen wall, his left hand, the good one. He pressed it flat against the packed soil and held it there, and his face did the thing that faces do when the body receives information that the mind has been refusing, a kind of settling, a loosening of something that had been held against the possibility of being wrong. They walked the full length of the tunnel without speaking, past the grain storage connection along the longer run toward the barn. Clara held the lantern and let him look at the construction. The timber supports the packed earth above the diagonal bracing she had fitted in January. She did not explain anything. She had explained everything she had to explain to him in September on his porch with the journal open in her hands, and he had put it down and said the numbers didn't prove anything. The tunnel proved it. She let the tunnel do the talking. They came through into the barn. Bertram stood in the entrance and looked at Clara's animals. The horses steady in their stalls, the cows unmoved. The pigs active and fed and indifferent to the storm pressing on the walls above them. He stood there for a long time. He said quietly that he had lost 2 hogs. She said she knew. She said she was sorry. He said his wife had cried over it. She said she understood. He looked at the pigs in their pen. They were doing what they had been doing all morning, moving and rooting and going about the business of being pigs in a space that was not asking anything extra of them. Then Bertram Holt turned around and looked at Clara directly. He said, "I was wrong about this. Not I was wrong about you. Not I apologize." He said, "I was wrong about this," meaning the tunnel, meaning the idea, meaning the 3 years of observation and the 2 months of digging, and the things she had built from nothing but attention and determination and the willingness to be considered a fool for as long as it took to find out if she was right. He said it quietly without drama in the manner of a man making a statement of fact in front of a witness. As though the animals around them were the witness and the tunnel behind them was the witness, and the storm pressing against the walls was the witness, and it required only that he say it out loud to complete something that had been waiting to be completed since September. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said we should get back before the lantern oil runs low. She turned and led him back through the tunnel toward the house. He followed, and the ground held its temperature around them, and the storm continued to do what it was doing at the surface, which was everything it could, which was not enough. The storm broke on the morning of the fourth day. It did not break gently. It stopped the way it had started completely, and all at once, and what replaced it was a silence so total that Clara stood in it for a moment before she trusted it. The world outside was transformed in the way that serious winter storms transform landscapes. Everything buried or drifted or relocated from where it had been to somewhere it had not been before. The fence line on the north side of the property was gone under 4 feet of drift. The road that ran past the front of the homestead was not a road anymore. The sky above all of it was the particular hard blue of a Dakota morning. After a storm, the blue so clear and cold, it seemed to have been scraped clean of everything that had been in it before. Clara walked the tunnel end to end and checked every timber and every joint, looking for storm damage, for stress fractures, for anything the 3 days of pressure had produced in the underground structure. She found one small area where the packed earth above the log roof had settled slightly, producing a shallow depression rather than a fracture, not a structural concern, but worth monitoring. She noted its location and moved on. She checked each animal with the same thoroughness she checked them every morning. She measured what remained of the hay supply against what had been consumed during the storm. She calculated her firewood against her projections for the remaining weeks of winter. The numbers were better than they should have been, not dramatically, but measurably, verifiably against 3 years of records that said what normal looked like and what this was not. She had not lost an animal. She had not exhausted her wood supply. She had not sent her children out into the storm. She had not opened her exterior door more than twice in 3 days, once for Mabel and once for Bertram. The accounting across the broader community was different. 3 families in that part of the territory had lost livestock they could not afford to lose before spring. One family had lost enough that the question of whether they would be able to stay on their land through another year was not a comfortable question. 2 men had suffered cold injuries to their hands that would affect their capacity to work through the spring planting season. An Orrin Pfeiffer who had wintered alone in the northern stretch of the territory for more than 2 decades had been found in his barn. He had covered the 40 steps from his house. He had not covered the 40 steps back. The same 40 steps that had opened this story closed it now, and there was nothing to add to that fact that the fact itself did not already say. Mabel Denker left on the day the storm broke, once it was clear the road was passable enough. Her son's hand had recovered slowly but fully, which Clara had expected, but was quietly relieved to confirm. Mabel dressed herself in her dried layers and stood in Clara's kitchen and looked at the table between them. She did not apologize. Clara had not expected her to. Mabel was not built for the direct apology, not from coldness, but from a kind of constitutional difficulty with the explicit admission of having been wrong, a difficulty that Clara recognized because she had seen it in some of her best students in Ohio, the ones who were smart enough to know when they had made an error, and proud enough to find the saying of it almost physically painful. What Mabel did was look at Clara for a moment with an expression that had more in it than her face usually allowed. Then she said that she was grateful for the shelter and for the attention to her son's hand. Clara said that no thanks were necessary and that she was glad the boy was all right. Mabel put on her hat and went out into the cold. 3 weeks later, her son arrived at Clara's door with a basket. Inside were 4 jars of Mabel's preserved plums and a folded note. The note said in Mabel's direct and undecorated handwriting that she was glad the idea had proven sound and that she hoped the spring thaw would treat the tunnel kindly. It was not an apology. It was the closest thing to one that Mabel Denker had in her, and Clara accepted it in the spirit it was intended, which was genuine, which was enough. She pressed the note flat between 2 pages of the journal and went on with her work. Bertram Holt came back in April when the ground had softened enough to make digging a possibility again. He came on foot, which was unusual for a distance of 2 miles. He came in the morning when Clara was in the yard assessing what the winter had left behind. He walked across the yard and stopped a respectful distance from her and said that he was thinking about putting in a passage of his own, shorter than hers, just barn to house. He said that he would be grateful if she was willing to talk him through what she had learned. He said it plainly without elaborate preamble because he was a man who believed that plain speaking was a form of respect. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said she would be glad to. They sat on the porch and she brought the journal out and she walked him through it, the 3 years of temperature readings, the methodology she had developed for determining depth, the approach to timber sizing and spacing that she had worked out through observation, and through the one section that had failed and required a repair. She showed him the diagonal bracing she had used in January and why it had outperformed the original vertical approach. She showed him the firewood numbers from the winter just past and the animal condition records and the data from the storm. Bertram listened with the complete attention of a man who has decided to learn something and is going to learn it properly. He asked practical questions that came from genuine engagement with the problem. When something she said contradicted what he had assumed, he asked her to explain the contradiction rather than letting it pass. It was the best conversation she had had with a neighbor since Edmund died. When they finished, he stood to leave. He stood at the edge of the porch for a moment and looked at the geared and the tunnel mounds and the barns sitting solid at the far end of the property. He said without turning around that he had thought about what she had shown him in September. The journal, the numbers. He said he could see now that the numbers had been saying exactly what she had told him they were saying. He said he appreciated her patience with him. Then he went home across the 2 miles of softening spring ground, his notes rolled under his arm. Arvid Strand came in the autumn of 1892, after the harvest and before the first hard cold. He came alone without his father, which Clara took as meaningful. He tied his horse at the post near the road and walked across the yard with his hat in his hand, which was not his usual manner. He stood before her and held out a ledger, the kind sold at general stores for farm accounting, repurposed. It was a journal, his handwriting large and somewhat uneven. Started the previous winter, he explained, watching her face as she read. He had recorded temperature observations and animal behavior and firewood consumption, the things he had noticed about the way the cold worked on his family's property. He had not told anyone he was doing it. He had done it because, after the storm, he had understood that Clara had not been guessing. She had been watching, and he had thought that watching was something he could do as well. Clara read several pages. She read them carefully. The observations were genuine. He had a good eye. He had noticed things she had noted in her own journal, the frost patterns on the walls, the behavioral indicators in livestock before weather changes the relationship between door use and interior temperature. She looked up from the journal. She said he was observing correctly. She said the recording was sound. She said he needed to add temperature measurements at consistent points along his barn wall at ground level and at 4 feet and at 8 feet taken on the same days each week, because the pattern would not be visible from a single data point and would only emerge over time. He listened. He asked what kind of thermometer she used and where she had acquired it. He asked how she had determined where the frost line sat on her property. She answered everything. She answered it all completely and without withholding, because the information was not hers in any exclusive sense. It had come to her from observation and patience and the willingness to pay attention, and those were available to anyone. He took his journal back when she returned it. He stood with it for a moment. He said, not quite looking at her, that he had laughed when he had seen her driving those stakes into the ground 2 autumns ago. He said it the way a person says a thing they have been carrying and need to set down somewhere that isn't themselves. Clara looked at him for a moment. She said she knew. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He walked back across the yard and untied his horse and rode back the way he had come. By the autumn of 1893, three properties in that part of the territory had underground passage systems connecting their buildings. None were identical to Clara's. Each had been adapted to the particular geography and needs of the place it served. Bertram's ran only from his house to his barn and was shallower than hers by 2 feet, which he compensated for with thicker timber above the roof. The Strand family had dug from their house to a secondary storage structure rather than directly to the barn, a modification that made sense for their layout. All three drew from the same source. All three held their temperature through the winter. Garfield Cross arrived in the spring of 1896 from Pennsylvania, a man of practical intelligence who had heard about the homestead from a land agent in the eastern part of the state. He came and saw what was there and walked the tunnel on his second day, the full circuit from house to grain storage to barn, running his hands along the timbers, the way Bertram had run his hand along the earthen wall 4 years before. He came back out and stood in the yard and looked at the property with the expression of a man who has just understood something he had underestimated. He had the sense to ask questions before forming opinions, and the questions he asked were the right ones, specific and practical, and directed at understanding rather than at demonstrating his own existing knowledge. Clara answered them the way she answered everything, plainly and completely. At some point during that conversation, she looked at him and thought of Edmund not with grief exactly, not anymore, but with the particular clarity that comes when you have carried something long enough that you can finally see its shape from the outside. Edmund had loved her in the way of a man who acts consistently without examining his feelings. This man, she thought, would examine his feelings and act on them anyway, which was a different thing, and perhaps the thing she needed now. They were married in the autumn of that year. He extended the tunnel to include the equipment outbuilding he put up the following spring, and he retimbered the original barn section when the cottonwood logs began to show their age. He asked her about every modification before he made it and listened to her answers in the way that Bertram had listened on the porch in April of 1892, with the complete attention of someone who understands that the person across from them knows something worth knowing. The tunnel served the property for decades. The family that purchased it in 1921, when Clara and Garfield moved east to be closer to their grandchildren, found the passage system intact and used it. A section of the original run the part from the grain storage toward the barn that Clara had dug in the cold weeks of October 1891 was still in use as a root storage area into the 1930s. Long past the time when anyone on the property knew or thought about who had dug it or why. Nora, who had grown from the 11-year-old with the lantern into a woman with children of her own, wrote about it to her youngest daughter in a letter composed sometime in the middle of that decade. She wrote it the way her mother had taught her to write things plainly and precisely, without embellishment, because the plainness of a true thing is sufficient. She wrote that her mother had not invented anything. She wrote that the ground beneath Dakota Territory had been holding its temperature 6 feet below the frost line since long before anyone arrived to measure it. She wrote that every person who ever stood above that ground had access to the same information Clara had access to. She wrote that what her mother had done was stand still long enough to feel it and then refuse in the face of everything the community around her said and implied, and wrote in letters to the mail pickup point to let the feeling go unexamined. She wrote that on the worst night of the worst storm, in the memory of that part of the territory her mother had slept, not from indifference, not from ignorance of the danger, but because she had done the work and the work was done, and the ground was doing what the ground had always done, which was hold. She closed the letter with the date and her name plain and without decoration, because a name at the bottom of a true account is enough. It is enough.